Sergeant James Carter was a 28-year-old soldier who carried himself with quiet confidence. Standing tall at 6 feet, his lean frame spoke of the discipline instilled by years of military service. His deep brown eyes were windows to a soul that had seen both the harshness of war and the beauty of camaraderie. James wasn't just a soldier. He was a son, a protector, and, above all, a man driven by love for his family. Growing up in a modest neighborhood in Atlanta, James had always admired his mother, Mary Carter, who raised him single-handedly after his father passed away when James was only 5. Mary's unwavering faith and strength became his guiding light. She often told him, "No matter how far you go, always remember where you came from." Those words echoed in his mind as he faced the challenges of his military career. James had been deployed overseas for nearly 2 years without leave. The weight of separation from his mother grew heavier with each passing day. His calls home were brief, but filled with warmth. "I'm proud of you," Mary would say every time, even as her voice quivered with emotion. James knew she missed him, but she rarely let it show. James's days on deployment were a blur of early mornings, grueling training sessions, and moments of intense focus. The sound of boots hitting gravel, the distant hum of helicopters, and the constant need for vigilance defined his existence. Yet, amid the chaos, he found solace in writing letters to his mother. For Mary, life revolved around her small but vibrant church community. Every Sunday, she donned her best dress, clutched her Bible, and walked to Zion Baptist Church, where she had been a member for over 30 years. Her days were filled with volunteering, praying, and offering support to anyone in need. Despite her active life, there was an unshakable void. Her only child was thousands of miles away. Each evening, Mary sat by the window with a cup of tea, gazing at the stars. She whispered prayers for James's safety, her faith a steadfast companion in his absence. James's world was stark and utilitarian, defined by the military base's rigid structure. The barracks were lined with bunk beds, each draped with the same olive-green blankets. Outside, the desert stretched endlessly, its golden sands shimmering under the relentless sun. Despite the physical challenges, James found comfort in the camaraderie of his fellow soldiers, who had become his second family. In contrast, Mary's world was filled with warmth and familiarity. Zion Baptist Church, a small brick building with stained glass windows, stood at the heart of her community. Inside, wooden pews gleamed under the soft glow of hanging chandeliers. The walls echoed with hymns every Sunday, creating a sense of unity and hope. Mary's modest home, just a few blocks from the church, was a testament to her love for her son. Photographs of James lined the mantel, his high school graduation, his first day in uniform, and the time he surprised her on her birthday years ago. A neatly folded American flag sat in a glass case on the shelf, a reminder of James's dedication to serving his country. Despite their strong bond, the distance had taken its toll on both James and Mary. James often lay awake at night, staring at the ceiling, wondering if his mother was truly okay. He had heard the slight tremor in her voice during their last call and sensed that she was feeling lonelier than she admitted. Mary, too, carried a quiet worry. Her prayers for James's safety had grown more fervent, and she often found herself lingering longer at the church altar, seeking strength. Her pastor, Reverend Samuel, had noticed the change and offered her words of comfort. Unbeknownst to Mary, James had been granted leave. As he planned his surprise, he couldn't shake the fear that something might go wrong. Would she be overwhelmed? Would the moment live up to the reunion he had envisioned? The stage was set for an emotional reunion, one that would not only bring joy but also challenge the depth of their faith and love. The day James received his leave orders felt surreal. Standing in the commander's office, holding the papers in his hand, he could hardly believe it. 2 weeks back home. He immediately thought of his mother and her unrelenting prayers for his safety. This was the opportunity he had dreamed of, a chance to surprise her and let her know how much she meant to him. He reached out to his pastor, Reverend Samuel, who was more than eager to help. The two brainstormed the perfect way to make the moment unforgettable. Reverend Samuel suggested that James walk into the church during Sunday service, right after the choir's opening hymn. "That's when she'll be the most focused," the pastor explained with a grin. "It'll be the last thing she expects." James agreed, but coordinating the surprise wasn't easy. He had to ensure no one accidentally spilled the secret. Reverend Samuel swore the church members to silence, emphasizing the importance of keeping the surprise intact. Back at the base, James packed his few belongings with trembling hands, his heart racing with anticipation. The thought of seeing his mother's face again filled him with both excitement and nervousness. What if she was overwhelmed? What if he couldn't find the right words to say? The plane ride home was a mix of emotions for James. As the aircraft cut through the clouds, he stared out of the window, his mind flooded with memories of his childhood. He thought about his mother's warm smile, the way she'd hum gospel songs while cooking, and her unwavering strength during tough times. He also remembered the sacrifices she had made for him. She had worked 2 jobs to put him through school, always making sure he had everything he needed. The thought of finally being able to hug her again brought tears to his eyes, but he quickly wiped them away. He didn't want anyone on the plane to see him cry. James's excitement was tinged with nerves. What if his mother was upset that he hadn't told her in advance? What if she fainted from the shock? As much as he had planned this surprise, the uncertainty of her reaction gnawed at him. But then he smiled, imagining the joy on her face. It'll be worth it, he thought to himself. Every second of it. Back home, Reverend Samuel had subtly altered Mary's Sunday routine to accommodate the surprise. He asked her to read a special prayer during the service, something she had never done before. "Your faith inspires this congregation, Sister Mary," he told her. "It's only fitting that you lead this part of the service." Mary felt honored, but slightly nervous. She spent the evening before the service practicing the prayer, her voice soft but steady. Little did she know, the entire church was abuzz with anticipation. On Sunday morning, Mary walked into the church as she always did, greeting familiar faces and taking her seat in the second row. She noticed a few whispers and smiles from the congregation, but thought nothing of it. Reverend Samuel's sermon began as usual, but there was an unusual energy in the room. Meanwhile, James was waiting just outside the church, dressed in his crisp military uniform. His heart pounded as he heard the choir's voices carry through the doors. This was it, the moment he had been waiting for. The stage was set. The congregation was ready. And Mary had no idea her life was about to change in the most beautiful way. As the choir finished their opening hymn, Reverend Samuel stood at the pulpit, his voice calm but commanding. Before we move on to today's message, I'd like to take a moment to recognize someone special in this congregation, Sister Mary Carter. Mary froze in her seat, surprised by the sudden attention. She wasn't used to being singled out. Reverend Samuel continued, "Sister Mary is a pillar of faith and strength, always praying for her loved ones and inspiring us all. Today, her prayers have been heard in a very special way." At that moment, the church doors swung open. The congregation turned to look, their murmurs filling the air. James stood there in his military uniform, his tall frame illuminated by the sunlight streaming through the open doors. Mary's heart stopped. For a second, she thought her mind was playing tricks on her. Was this real? Could it be her son? "Mom," James said, his voice breaking. The entire church erupted in applause and cheers as Mary slowly rose from her seat. Tears streamed down her face as she stumbled toward James, her hands trembling. "James," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the commotion. "It's me, Mom," he said, pulling her into a tight embrace. The church congregation watched the emotional reunion with tears in their eyes. Many of them had known James since he was a boy and had seen Mary's unwavering dedication to her son. "Praise God," one elderly woman exclaimed, clapping her hands. Others joined in, some wiping away tears, while others sang softly in the background. Reverend Samuel stepped down from the pulpit and approached the mother and son, a warm smile on his face. "James, welcome home," he said, extending his hand. "You've made your mother, and this entire church, so proud." James shook his hand firmly. "Thank you, Reverend. I couldn't have done this without you." The pastor laughed. "The honor is all mine. Today is a testament to the power of faith and family." A few of the younger children in the congregation ran up to James, their curiosity overcoming their shyness. "Are you a real soldier?" one of them asked. James crouched down, smiled, and nodded. "Yes, I am." The children beamed, their eyes wide with admiration. As the initial excitement settled, James found himself overwhelmed with emotion. Holding his mother in his arms after so long was everything he had hoped for, but it also brought back memories of the time they had lost. He couldn't help but think about the countless nights he had spent worrying about her while stationed overseas. Had she been lonely? Had she needed him? The guilt of not being there weighed heavily on him, even in this moment of joy. "I missed you so much, Mom," he whispered. Mary pulled back slightly, looking into his eyes. "And I missed you, James. But I never stopped praying for you. I knew God would bring you back to me." Her words brought James a sense of comfort, but also a pang of regret. He had always admired his mother's faith, but there were times when he had doubted his own. The hardships of military life had tested him in ways he couldn't explain, and he wondered if he had done enough to deserve this moment of happiness. Mary seemed to sense his inner conflict. "James, don't you carry that burden," she said softly. "You've done more than enough. You've made me proud every single day." James nodded, but the lump in his throat wouldn't go away. He realized that this reunion wasn't just about making his mother happy. It was also about finding peace within himself. As the service continued, Reverend Samuel asked James to say a few words to the congregation. James hesitated at first, unsure if he could put his emotions into words. But as he stood at the pulpit, looking out at the familiar faces of his childhood church, he felt a sense of clarity. "Coming home today is the greatest blessing I could ask for," he began. "But this moment isn't just about me. It's about my mom and her unwavering faith. She's the reason I'm standing here today." The congregation erupted in applause, and Mary's eyes filled with tears once again. Unbeknownst to James, the pastor had one more surprise in store. He smiled knowingly, waiting for just the right moment to reveal it. As the applause died down, Reverend Samuel stepped back to the pulpit, a twinkle of excitement in his eyes. He cleared his throat and said, "Now, before we continue, there's one more thing I'd like to share with the congregation." James and Mary exchanged puzzled glances, unsure of what the pastor meant. "James," Reverend Samuel began, "your service and sacrifices haven't gone unnoticed, not just by your mother, but by this entire community. We've all been praying for you, and today, it's time for us to show you just how much you mean to us." The pastor gestured toward the back of the church. The doors opened again, and a group of men and women entered, carrying a folded banner that read, "Welcome home, Sergeant James Carter." The congregation cheered as James stood frozen, overwhelmed by the outpouring of love. But that wasn't the only surprise. A man in a sharp military uniform stepped forward, holding a plaque. "Sergeant Carter," the man said, his voice steady and authoritative, "on behalf of the United States Army, I'm honored to present you with a commendation for your exceptional service and bravery during your deployment. Your actions have saved lives and inspired others to serve with honor." James's jaw tightened as he fought back tears. He accepted the plaque with trembling hands, his heart pounding. He turned to the congregation and saw the pride and admiration on their faces. As the applause subsided, Reverend Samuel stepped forward again, his voice softer this time. "James, while you were away, your mother shared something very special with me. She told me about the day you enlisted and how proud she was, but she also shared her biggest fear." James looked at his mother, who was now wiping her eyes with a tissue. He hadn't known she had confided in the pastor. "She told me," Reverend Samuel continued, "that her greatest fear wasn't losing you. It was the thought that you might forget how much you're loved back home." The room grew silent. James's chest tightened as the weight of the words sank in. He had never doubted his mother's love, but hearing her deepest fear spoken aloud struck a chord he hadn't expected. Reverend Samuel smiled gently. "But let me tell you this, son. Not only has your mother's love carried you through, but so has the love of this community. And today, we're here to remind you that you are never alone." At that moment, James realized the full extent of what he had been missing. It wasn't just his mother's love. It was the connection to his roots, the unwavering support of the people who had watched him grow. James stepped back from the pulpit, his hands shaking. He turned to his mother, who was standing just a few feet away, her eyes glistening with tears. "Mom," he said, his voice breaking, "I had no idea you felt that way, but I promise you, I've never forgotten where I came from or the love you've always shown me. It's what's kept me going all these years." Mary took his hands in hers, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "And I'll keep praying for you, James. No matter where you go or what you face, you'll always have a home here." The congregation watched in silence, many of them moved to tears. It was a rare moment of vulnerability and connection, a reminder of the strength that comes from love and faith. As James stood there, holding his mother's hands, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. The guilt, the doubts, the fear, all of it began to fade away, replaced by a deep gratitude for the people who had supported him, even from afar. For the first time in a long time, James felt truly at home. The service ended with a powerful hymn, and the congregation lined up to personally greet James. Each handshake, hug, and kind word filled the void he hadn't realized he was carrying. Afterward, James and Mary returned home together, walking hand in hand like they used to when he was a boy. The sight of their modest home brought a wave of nostalgia. Mary's garden, filled with vibrant flowers she tended every morning, seemed brighter than ever. Inside, James noticed the little details his mother had kept the same. His old football trophies on the shelf, the framed picture of him in his high school graduation robe, and the cross hanging above the kitchen door. That evening, over a simple home-cooked meal, James opened up to Mary in a way he hadn't in years. He shared stories from his deployment, some lighthearted, some painful, and listened as she spoke about her quiet moments of loneliness and faith. "Promise me you'll never keep things bottled up again," Mary said, her voice firm yet tender. "I promise," James replied, his heart lighter than it had been in years. The following week, James attended every church service with Mary. The congregation welcomed him like he'd never left. He even joined Reverend Samuel in speaking to the youth group, sharing his experiences and encouraging them to pursue their dreams while staying grounded in faith. James also found himself drawn to reconnecting with old friends and neighbors. He volunteered to help a local veterans organization, offering mentorship to young soldiers preparing for deployment. Each act of giving back deepened his connection to the community and reminded him of his roots. For Mary, having James home was a blessing beyond words. She noticed the transformation in her son. He was more open, more at peace. She often found him sitting by the window, gazing at the stars, a soft smile on his face. "You look happy," she told him one evening. "I am, Mom," he replied, "because I finally understand what home really means." One quiet Sunday evening, James sat on the porch, watching the sunset. He thought about how much his life had changed in just a few weeks. He had come home hoping to bring joy to his mother, but in the process, he had found healing for himself. "I thought I was the one surprising you," he said to Mary, who was sitting beside him, knitting. "But it turns out, you and this community gave me the bigger gift." Mary chuckled softly. "That's what faith does, James. It gives more than you could ever expect." James nodded, a deep sense of gratitude settling over him. He had been through hardships, seen the worst of humanity, but now he felt something he hadn't felt in years, hope. As the final rays of sunlight disappeared behind the horizon, James stood up and stretched. He walked over to the garden, where a small American flag fluttered in the breeze. He knelt down, adjusting it so it stood tall and proud. Behind him, Mary watched silently, her heart full. "Mom," James said, turning to her with a smile, "thank you for never giving up on me." "I never will," she replied, her voice steady with conviction. James looked up at the night sky, the stars shining bright above. He felt a renewed sense of purpose, not just as a soldier but as a son, a neighbor, and a member of a community that loved him unconditionally. In that moment, he knew he was exactly where he was meant to be.